Yo, what's going on, everybody? It's your boy, Lou Extra, I guess. But it's, everything you can call me from Lou Braun to Young Lou. I do a lot of things, but in this video, it's going to be posted on my Extra channel, so I hope y'all appreciate that. So this video is called, what is it called? Why did Mao win the Chinese Civil War? Now, there's a lot of things I got to explain. Number one, I am a history student. I currently study at a university near Chicago, and it's been a great experience so far. And I've learned really a lot as I've studied throughout these years. And so, for this case, it's actually special to me because I grew up as an Asian American, second generation, and as an Asian American, I have had to endure a lot of things, and it's what it is. But especially in the Midwest. But in this case, some of my family actually came from this time period, and during the Civil War, it was very intense, and obviously they're going to talk about it in this video, but it actually, connects to me, and I come from that type of lineage, and I'll explain in this video. I hope you guys appreciate it. Drop a sub and like the video if you guys like it, and let's get into this. This channel is called History Matters. They do a lot of like history content, and they've been reacted to by a lot of people. They have millions of subs. They're dope, so go sub to them, obviously. Before you sub to me, even, just gotta shout them out. And yeah, history matters. And yeah, so I'll try to put my 2 cents in it and like let you all know what I think and like my opinion on it. But if I don't know something, I'll look it up and maybe they'll teach me a thing or two. So anyway, yeah.
49, after years of bitter fighting, Mao Zedong
Wait,
declared the creation of the
wait,
People's
hold on.
Republic. In 1949, after years of bitter fighting, Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. And just under a year later, his new government had finished mopping up most of the opposing nationalist forces, leaving only Taiwan in their hands. But as many of you will know, as of 1945, Mao's communists were only in control of this territory, whereas the nationalists had the rest, including all of China's industrial centres. They also had financial and material support from the United States, as well as having a larger army and population base to work with. This raises an obvious question. How on earth did the communists win when they started at such a disadvantage? Why was Mao victorious in the Chinese Civil War? Now, it's important to note that whilst the Chinese Civil War is often seen as something occurring in the wake of World War II, it had actually been ongoing since either the early 1920s or 5 seconds after the fall of the Qing dynasty, depending on how you count it. As you'll all know, China had been ruled by emperors since basically forever, and this continued up until 1911 when revolution. After a ceasefire, Yuan Shikai, the new prime minister, managed to convince the emperor to abdicate, and he then became president. Not sufficiently happy with his new title, Shikai had a thought. Being in charge is okay, but how can I do it in a robe? Which is when he had the brilliant idea of making himself emperor in late 1915. This went down about as well as you'd expect, and within a few months there was another civil war, followed by his swift abdication and then death. For the next decade, China wasn't really a unified political entity, with different warlords claiming sovereignty over their own territories and cliques. And the one in control of Beijing was given the support of the international powers and so could claim to be the legitimate rulers of China, but honestly, it was all just a mess. During this period, in the south of the country, the nationalists who wanted the restoration of the 1912 Republican Constitution formed an alliance with the communists to fight against the ruling clique in the north. By 1927, the nationalists and the communists were on the cusp of victory, when the
But
nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek decided that he didn't need the communists anymore, and so it was time for a violent purge.
okay, so there's one thing they forgot to mention. There was a person before Chiang Kai-shek, which people pronounce it Chiang Kai-shek. It's pronounced Chiang Kai-shek, I promise you. And in this case, Chiang Kai-shek was the ruler that he had to fight for it. Let's be honest. There was a bloody, beginning of the Civil War, pre-Civil War to this Civil War, which was the first Civil War, which is in the 1920s, and then the second Civil War after the 1940s, which is a whole other thing. But anyway, so in this case, before Chiang Kai-shek, it was a guy named Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen was considered the founder of the PRC. And actually, this is the crazy thing. This is the only thing that Taiwan, which is the Republic of China, and the CCP, which is the Communist Party of China, the one thing they agree on is that Sun Yat-sen is the founder of modern China after the Qing Empire. So when they took over, the first leader was actually Sun Yat-sen. He was the founder of modern China, mostly the Republic of China. Then the Communist China, which is afterward and still goes on. So anyway, yeah, Chiang Kai-shek is the leader, and in this case, he rules after Sun Yat-sen, and then they have a civil war, and that's a whole different story. They'll get into it, but just wanted to add that background.
He offed all of the communists
Oh,
that he could
sorry.
reach, and the rest fled into the countryside. The next year, Chiang overthrew the government and made himself the head of the new nationalist Chinese state. He now had two problems, though. The first was the ever more aggressive Japanese government next door, who in 1931 made their full intentions clear when it took control of Manchuria and placed it under the rule of the last Qing emperor as their puppet state. The second problem was the ongoing communist insurgency throughout the Chinese countryside. There were numerous communist strongholds throughout the country, which the nationalists would surround and crush one by one, the most notable of which was here in the mountains of Jiangxi. The nationalists moved in for the kill in 1934, but the communists were able to escape and begin what is now called the Long March, where over the course of a year, communist forces marched across all of China before ending up here in Yan'an, having lost only 90% of their soldiers. Instead, they reconstituted their forces and began another insurgency. After some good old-fashioned communist infighting, Mao Zedong appeared as the leader of the communists, and he decided to focus on the rural peasantry instead of urban workers, which gave him access to more soldiers who appreciated his anti-landowner policies. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to crush them, but his advisors and generals pushed him to instead negotiate. The reason for this was that it was obvious to them that Japan would soon invade and try to subjugate China as a whole, and so they wanted the government's full attention focused on repelling them. As such, the two sides started to negotiate, but Chiang was only using it as a diversion, leading his generals to do the only thing that they could think of to convince him: kidnap him, which they did in late 1936. They negotiated with the communists, who were now no longer interested in making an accord, but instead in getting rid of Chiang permanently. This didn't happen because the Soviet government threatened to withhold military aid if Chiang was harmed, because Moscow wanted a stronger China to counterbalance Japan, who had both of them in their sights. Chiang reluctantly agreed and was then promptly released, after which he then publicly declared that he never meant any of it. The next year, the Japanese began the Second Sino-Japanese War, or World War II, depending on how you look at it, and the nationalists and the communists soon came to an accord because they both agreed that those guys were worse. Now, the war didn't start well for the nationalists, and by 1939 the Japanese were able to push them all the way back to here, whereas the communists resorted to guerrilla warfare, and were able to damage the Japanese war effort from behind their lines. The united front between the nationalists and the communists was never very strong, and when the communists were able to incorporate more civilians into their forces and they sensed nationalist weakness, the two soon started fighting again. Part of this was that the nationalist army was obviously too busy to reallocate enough forces to suppress the communists, but the communists were easily able to find allies and recruits during the war, mostly because of the conduct and the competence of the nationalists. Said army and government was incredibly corrupt and would often rob Chinese civilians and openly steal tax revenue for themselves. And throughout the war and the preceding civil war, the nationalists had a reputation for brutal reprisals against anyone who stood against them, or anyone who they thought had collaborated with the Japanese or the communists. This, combined with their inability to stop the Japanese advance and the desperate measures that they undertook to delay them, meant that the Chinese people saw them as useless brutes. Whereas the communists had been quick to release any prisoners of war that didn't want to join them and had strictly forbidden their soldiers from stealing from local populations. Also, the fact that they were the smaller force and also weren't often directly engaging the Japanese meant that they could paint themselves as far more successful. So in 1941, Japan decided that fighting China alone was boring, and so invited America and the British Empire to fight too. As you'll all be aware, this was the start of the end of the Japanese Empire. After a couple of American bombs and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese surrendered, World War II was over, and the Chinese now had to look to rebuilding their country, with the nationalists in control of this, the communists this, and the Soviets occupying Manchuria, which they agreed to give back as soon as they were done looting its industry. Communist guerrillas had spent most of the war building up strongholds across China, and the loyal local populations weren't going to suddenly side with the nationalists, especially given the fact that Chiang Kai-shek's government was quick to restore the Chinese landlords who had lost all of their land to.
Wait. How long? Okay. So this video is 5 minutes. Um, World War II, there was a lot of things that happened in World War II that obviously they didn't get to. I'm not saying they need to make this like a 20-minute video, but like they could have probably dived a little bit more into like, some of the things that happened, because honestly, the Chinese did get screwed over. And so they need to dive more into like these subjects in order for them to, I think the West needs to do that more. So, um, that's just my opinion, but Yeah, other than that, they explained it perfectly. There's a couple things that I didn't know, and now they're going to talk about the Chinese Civil War, which was post World War II. But during World War II, like, you had a lot of, like they said, literally, I'd say 2/5 of China was taken by the Japanese, or at least semi-occupied by the Japanese. And the Chinese needed to gain inch by inch to get back what they already had. And so in this case, you have Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek, they're going to war because of their two different ideologies. And you have one communism, one fascism. In this case, they're going to go at each other. Lasts about 5 years, and you'll see in this video how it turns out for the other side.
The Japanese or communists, which was obviously not very popular with the peasantry. Another issue for the restored nationalist government was that it needed foreign help to even return to power. Chiang couldn't get his troops back to the cities to receive the Japanese surrender. As such, his troops had to be taken there by the United
Wait, what
States.
did they say?
Another issue for the restored nationalist government was that it needed foreign help to even return to power. Chiang couldn't get his troops back to the cities to receive the Japanese surrender.
Oh, he said they couldn't get to the city they couldn't get to the city in time for the Japanese surrender. So, unfortunate.
As such, his troops had to be taken there by the United States. And some of this took so long that the surrender.
That's the thing. China was not that industrialized during the nationalist regime. The U.S. had to massively help. I don't think, to be honest, they didn't. And I'm writing a whole paper about how the United States screwed China over, and that's a whole other thing. But in order, like, just in general, the United States, I think they gave China advice. The Japanese invaded, so they kind of had to copy a little bit from the Japanese, at least from what they knew at the time. So it's tough, but it is what it is. But I think the nationalists kind of got a lot of flack for what shouldn't have happened.
The Japanese forces were asked to garrison cities to prevent the increasingly popular communists from taking them over. And so, needing the help of their former brutal enemy was extremely.
Not saying they were perfect, though. Not saying the nationalists were perfect, because they definitely, like he said, they were corrupt, but you gotta, I think it's, regardless of, like, what you see online or, like, see in the news and stuff like that, it's important to know, like, it's important to know the background of it. It's important to know the context. And I think in this case, these two different factions that are going at it, it seems like they, what was I going to say? They need to, they had different sides siding them, just like how during the Syrian war, the United States was siding one side, the Russia was siding the other, and then during the what was it? Iran, kind of the same thing. There were two different factions, and Russia too, like like other people spying on them and each other, like Cuba. There were other, the Bay of Pigs, where Kennedy was trying to go in and, like, invade Cuba, and a bunch of countries in Africa too. Like, there's a lot. Probably even Uganda and several other countries where both the USA and Russia were going at it, obviously, in the Cold War, and China just got fucking sandwiched in the middle of it.
Extremely damaging to Chiang's legitimacy. Soon after the war ended, the economy fell apart and the government couldn't pay its soldiers, many of whom defected to Mao. Now, even though Mao was more powerful than he'd ever been before, he still had a difficult task ahead of him. But he would soon get a major boon. As the Soviet Union was withdrawing from Manchuria, it was sure to hand the Japanese weapons and equipment it had captured to the communists. Now, Moscow had agreed to hand Manchuria over to Chiang's government, and so, to help Mao, they invited communist troops into the territory and helped them to build strongholds to fight from, whilst letting nationalist forces into the cities to technically fulfill their agreement. Briefly, Chiang and Mao tried to negotiate forming a government together, but this was obviously stupid, and so civil war. Brief.
Whoa. That's a lot of lists. That's a big list. We both hate each other with a passion. We both share a common goal of littering the Japanese in this case. We share mutually exclusive worldviews. We both refuse to share power with anyone else. That China is decent. Chow mein is decent. Our international backers don't really want peace. Um, that's true. The foreign invaders, the eight nation coalition attacked back during the Boxer Rebellion, and so a lot of these countries had to do what they had to do to keep themselves like gated, like not just China, but all the Asian countries together. And one by one, the West was just biting them up and taking them, or like forcing them to trade at gunpoint. So in this case, they tried to do a coalition government.
The communists resorted yet again to guerrilla tactics and wore the nationalist armies down. The Americans initially supported the nationalists with a lot of arms and money, but slowly their support began to wane. You see, the US military wasn't all too impressed by Chiang and his corrupt generals, who, throughout the civil conflicts in the war with the Japanese, had refused to undertake any offensives or lend their troops to others because it was the basis of their personal power. And as such, they didn't want to lose it. Soon, many American politicians believed that Chiang's time was up and that supporting him was just a waste of resources. When Chiang refused to allow democratic elections and also openly supported Harry Truman's opponent in the 1948 presidential election, the US decided to concentrate on other things and leave the nationalists to their fate. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that in the wake of the withdrawal of American support, the nationalist position weakened. In the year following, Chiang and his allies were forced to flee south, and it looked like there would be no foreign intervention to help them. Except there very briefly was. This wasn't the US returning or the British or French getting involved. This time it was Joseph Stalin who asked Mao to stop his advance down south. Stalin tried to convince Mao that advancing further south would stretch his forces out too thin and would force the Western allies to intervene, because obviously they wouldn't allow a member of the brand new UN Security Council to fall, especially to communists. But as you'll all know, they very clearly could. In fact, this attempted intervention was mostly because Stalin saw a divided China similar to a divided Germany. If Mao's China only controlled this, then it would need the USSR for its security against a permanent enemy. Whereas, if he held all of China, eventually he would be able to act independently. If you've ever seen China on a map, you'll know that Mao refused. And within a few months of this, the nationalist government had collapsed and its remnants had fled to Taiwan. Mao then proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China, which marked the first time that the country had been politically unified since the last days of the Qing dynasty. I hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle, Katoitska, Gustav Swan, Marvin.
That's wild. I didn't know that last part. Glad I learned it. And glad to History Matters for making this video, because there's definitely a couple things I learned, but I hope I could add a thing or two that I think they could have added that I knew, but things that in this video that they knew were actually astonishing to me. Like, I really did not know half of the last, I'd say from the last 5 minutes to the end of the video, I had zero idea about any of it. Besides, obviously, that the nationalists lost, the communists won, and now China is the way it is. With Mao's photo of him declaring that China is now under a new revolution. And, it is what it is. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I think I may post this, I may not, and I hope y'all enjoy. Sorry, sub, drop a like, comment, and I'll see y'all later. Peace.